Preview of Slaves and Exiles by Margaret Gaffney. Copyright 2020 by All Things That Matter Press. All rights reserved. Prologue. Decretals pertaining to the protection and preservation of Verdania and its people. It is hereby been declared in the presence of the people of Verdania, both human and cure, that Alexander Athanasius Ignatius is chosen henceforth from this day as High King of Verdania, to be both custodian and protector of all, to rule as leader of Verdania in accordance with the dignity assured to all individuals, and to dispense of his duties in a manner worthy of his calling as king. Royal Decretals from the Court of the High King of Verdania, Alexander Ignatius, Section 9820. In honor of the King Alexander's 700th Jubilee year, and 84th year celebrating his defeat of the warring Cure tribes and securing of freedom for the human race, it has been declared that he shall establish the royal authority of Sebastian and Gretchen Neath as King and Queen of men, who shall rule directly in the affairs of men in their entirety. King Alexander shall henceforth be known as High King of the Cure, and shall maintain a role of indirect custodian and protector in the affairs of men, but his main authority shall be directing the affairs of the Cure race. This shall include the power to place Cure in positions of worthy service to men where his majesty shall think it proper and useful for the benefit of all. With this newly granted authority to the kingship of men comes the unbreakable succession of the Neath heirs, who shall never be removed from this honor save by the power of the High King himself. This set forth formally in the presence of the High King and Royal Council. Queen Isabel paced the hall, twisting her hands and trying to swallow the anxiety that was rising in her throat. Her soft footsteps echoed on the stones in the well-lit chamber that contrasted sharply with the darkness outside. When she reached the far end of the room, she sat on her husband's throne and tried to be calm. Her knee began to bob up and down, and in a moment she was on her feet again, walking toward the heavy wooden doors. A draught of chilly air rushed past her, causing a shiver up her spine. She stopped in the center of the throne room and looked around at the silent stone walls and archways adorned with sculpted figures and colorful paintings. This room had always been too large for her simple tastes, except when it was filled with lively music and cheerful voices. An inexpressible sadness filled Isabel as she realized this room might never see another ball. Shaking her head, she turned around again and walked toward the oak doors. As she approached, she heard footsteps on the other side and paused, mustering all of her stateliness. However, only one of the doors opened, and her husband, Alexander, High King of the Cure, entered. He was dressed for battle in armor that was plain but reliable. His sword was sheathed in its leather scabbard, and he carried his helmet under his arm. As his gaze settled on his human wife, he was struck forcibly by how she looked 10 times her 34 years. Without moving, Isabel asked in an even voice, "Has the destination been verified?" "No," the High King answered, equally calm. "The War Council is waiting for the scouts to return." "Has Richard arrived?" "No, he's still waiting for the Cura warrior to arrive at the castle." "Will Andrew ride with you?" "No, I've instructed him to look after things here." "How soon do you think you'll set out?" "Within the hour." "Then—" Isabel walked to her husband and stood so close to him that she had to look up to see his face. She tried to finish her sentence, but the words caught in her throat. Alexander responded by dropping his helmet and wrapping his arms firmly around her, burying his face in her cascades of golden hair. Finally she looked up at him, her green eyes brimming with tears. When she saw her own pain reflected in his gaze, she tried to blink the tears away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Alexander tightened his hold on her, resting his chin on her head. "What can you possibly have to be sorry for, my darling?" "It isn't fair of me to make your leaving harder. I know it's not your doing." "I shouldn't have let it happen," he said in a hollow voice. "I should have paid closer attention." Suddenly he moved so that he could look directly into her eyes. "I am sorry I could not make this world a safer place for our son." Placing her hands on the side of Alexander's face, Isabel smiled and drew his head down to her so their foreheads touched. "There was never a father who did more for his son, my dearest," she whispered, "and no matter what happens, he will certainly know that every day of his life." Alexander enveloped her once again in his long arms. "I love you, my darling, and I love you, my king." When at last Isabel backed up slightly so that she could look at him again, her expression appeared more accepting and a little determined. "Ewan will be here in a moment, Alex, so I have to tell you, I've come to a decision about the future." He sighed. "Belle, before you tell me, consider what it will mean. I can't bear to think of you being alone for so long." "I want to do it," she said firmly. "I can wait." But you understand, time moves more slowly. It will feel like hundreds of years for you. Alex, I want to stay with my son for as long as I can. I know he'll need guidance. Now, of course, the best way would be for me to stay here, but if the worst should happen... Isabel swallowed hard. This is the closest I can be, and I don't want to finish my journey into the next world until I know you're waiting for me there. This is truly what you want? It is not what I want, but I wouldn't have things differently if they come to such a stand that the prince of the cure is left without his parents. Alexander took his wife's hand, bowing over it and gently kissing her knuckles. Then I will not refuse the last request of my queen. Straightening up, he held out his other hand as a tiny spark of light appeared and left in its wake 2 little diamond stars, clear as fresh water, which hung on a golden chain. Isabel turned around and held up her long hair so he could fasten the necklace on her. Once Alexander had done so, she rubbed the stars gently with her forefinger, causing them to momentarily change color to blue and then return to their transparent state. As she turned around to face her husband once again, an interruption appeared in the form of a little boy, who burst through the much smaller door at the other end of the hall and ran excitedly into his papa's arms. "Here is my king," Alexander laughed, allowing the child to climber up his arm and sit on his armored shoulder. "Mama," the boy said seriously, looking down at his father's unadorned, dark-haired head, "Papa's bad. He's not wearing his crown." "Oh, you've taken to telling on me, have you?" his father demanded, tickling him. The boy let out a peal of laughter and nearly toppled off his perch. Alexander quickly stabilized his son and allowed him to move to his mother's outstretched arms. The 5-year-old put his head on Isabel's shoulder and stuck his thumb in his mouth. Surveying Alexander for a moment, he removed his thumb long enough to announce that Papa was going to fight. "Yes, Ewan, Papa's going to fight," Isabel agreed. "But he'll come back." "Papa, are you taking my horsey?" he asked, as if this idea had been bothering him for some time. Alexander smiled crookedly. "No, of course not. You know he wouldn't let me ride him." "Uncle Richard says I jump like a master," Ewan announced with no small degree of pride in his voice. His father nodded. "So I heard. Should we go hunting when I come back?" The child grinned, clapping his hands. "Yes, we will go hunting when you come back." Suddenly one of the great doors opened, and the king's personal secretary, Andrew Absalom, entered. As he looked at the peaceful family scene before him, he was extremely hesitant to do his duty. "Your Majesty," he began apologetically, "the generals are assembled." "Thank you, Andrew." Alexander sighed and nodded as his friend left the room. "You need to say goodbye to your papa now. He has to leave," Isabel whispered in her son's ear. "Will Papa come back tomorrow?" Ewan asked. Alexander once again took his son, who encircled his father's neck with his short arms. "No, little one, but soon." "Papa, don't go," he insisted, holding on tighter. "Behave yourself," Isabel admonished. Ewan did as he was told, but gave an unhappy cry which turned her heart over. "Darling, Papa needs to go and fight, and we must wait for him to come back." Although still sad and afraid, Isabel mustered a smile. Voices just outside the door suddenly grew louder, causing the little family to be drawn out of their own circle and back into the affairs of the world. Alexander stared at those doors, took a deep breath, and turned back to his family. The contrast of what lay before him to what lay behind caused his heart to ache. For the final time, he enveloped his wife and son in a hug. "I love you both. I love you to my last breath and beyond that." "We love you too," Isabel whispered. After bestowing kisses on them, he turned and, picking up his helmet, made for the door. Just before opening it, Alexander looked back at his beloved family standing alone in the throne room of their castle. "Don't be afraid. This is not the end." He left the chamber, and the door closed firmly behind him. Screams rang in Anastasia's ears as she ran through the forest, clutching a bundle tightly to her chest. Her sword clanged in its sheath, making a terrible racket, but she didn't care. The sweat trickling from her forehead caused the soot on her blackened face to drip into her eyes, making them sting. Her breathing was so heavy she felt certain it could be heard a mile off. Her blood-splattered skirt kept catching on rocks and shrubs, but her only thought was to escape the excessive warmth and terrible crackling that lay behind her. An especially large tree root caused her to trip, but exhaustion didn't impede her impeccable reflexes, and she spun mid-fall so as to land on her back. The sudden stop reminded her mind of how tired the rest of her was. Laying still in the dirt, the Kura warrior looked blankly at the night sky that peeped in tiny windows through the forest canopy. Stars twinkled brightly, but they seemed distant and cold, making her shiver despite her own sweatiness and the warmth of the summer evening. Anastasia may have lain there forever, her long, shimmery blonde hair spread out like silvery rivers in the darkness. But the sound of muffled crying snapped her from her pensive state. Sitting up quickly, she crossed her legs and loosened the pressure of her arms on the bundle. She looked down and stroked the scrunched, red face of the infant, whose screams were growing louder. "Shh, shh, it's all right," she whispered, bouncing the baby in her arms. "Don't worry, no one's going to hurt you. I'm here. No one's going to hurt you. Shh, shh." The baby didn't stop crying. "Shh, shh, shh, I'm here." Although it was contrary to her stoic curé nature, Anastasia felt one single heavy tear rim her eye and slip down her cheek. "I know you want your mama and papa. I know. I want mine too. But we're all each other has now. And I've got to take care of you. Shh, shh. I know you don't want me. I wouldn't want me either. After everything I've done, nobody wants me," she whispered, swallowing hard. "But it's all right. We'll get along, you'll see. I'll keep you safe, and maybe one day your world will change for the better." The infant's sobs slowed until the two large dark eyes regarded the cura's face almost speculatively. Anastasia stroked the baby's cheek with one long finger, saying, "We'll get along, don't you worry. Oh, and before I forget." She reached into her dress pocket, feeling around for something. Her fingers found the desired item, and she extricated her hand, followed by a thin chain from which dangled a small key. "Your mamma wanted you to have this," she said as she carefully put the chain around the baby's neck. With new determination, the cura stood up and closed her eyes. She cast her mind far back to the memory of a place she had not thought of in over 60 years. She envisioned everything about it, the trees, the flowers, the old cottage. Nothing happened. Anastasia opened her eyes in confusion, then realization dawned on her as she looked down at the baby. "Having you with me changes everything," she whispered. "We'll have to walk, I suppose." Thank you for listening to this preview recording of Slaves and Exiles by Margaret Gaffney. You can find this title in full on Amazon.com. Also check out All Things That Matter Press website.